Thank you for the invitation. I don't know who dreamed up this title, but it is a dream title for me, so I'm going to run with it. This is a very different talk from Andrew's. It's really more about pain and how opiates got into the whole pain thing. So I have no disclosures. I'm actually going to take it back a bit further than Melzack and Wall to Descartes, because Descartes, even though it's a bit of an old chestnut, was actually a critical turning point in the way we as human beings thought about pain. So before Descartes, it was considered that pain was thrust upon people by external factors. No one was even thinking that there was anything internal about pain. Make me fully understand that the ills of the body are nothing else than the punishment and the encompassing symbol for the ills of the soul. Let me feel this pain sharply so I can make whatever is left of my life a continual penance to wash away the offenses I have committed. So not only are they thinking in those days that pain has been thrust upon them by external forces, they're also thinking that by glorifying it, that's how they deal with pain. That's how in those days they did deal with pain. They knew there were opiates and used opiates occasionally, but opiates were not widely available and they were not how most people dealt with pain. So along comes Descartes and he says something completely different. He says, no, that's not it. There's something happens and injures someone, or something is causing a change in pathology, and that is somehow transmitted through the nervous system to the brain. So that's really new and critically new thinking. So this is the earliest of the, where I and my generation, or we all came into the way we think about pain, and that is in a reductionist way. So he was the first to describe pain as a perception that exists in the brain. Now, he wasn't the first to know that there was a nervous system. There had been dissections of the pig in Roman times. There'd been detailed dissections of the nervous system, even in 1543. So it's not that there wasn't an understanding that there was a nervous system, but it was that there wasn't an understanding of what the nervous system actually did, especially in terms of transmitting pain. So you don't need to look at this slide in detail because I'm going to show it several times throughout this talk, but what it is to show that we came from this, until Descartes, the view that pain was caused by external events, to where we all came in, and that is the reductionist point of view. So we've become more and more through the last couple of hundred years focused down and down and down and down into the smaller events, micro events. So we began to understand there's a whole complex of different fibers that transmit different sensations. We began to understand the physiology, that it was all simple things like nerve conduction was an electrical conduction along nerves. And we began to see in quite a lot of detail exactly what the nervous pathways were. So this is the ascending pain pathway that goes through the thalamus and up into the higher centers and crosses over in the spinal cord. This is all the anatomy and physiology that we were taught in medical school. Now along come Henry Beecher and John Bonica in the 1940s to 1960s. They begin to think differently through Descartes. They begin to say, this is not right. This is not just a simple phenomenon that's happening along a line-labeled system. There are other things going on, and context is playing a major role in the experience of pain. It was actually Henry Beecher, who was at Harvard, who did very important work on placebo. He identified the importance of the placebo effect, and he also identified the importance of stress-induced analgesia, or the existence of stress-induced analgesia. This is a photo that Pat Wall discovered, at the Imperial War Museum in London, that Henry Beecher, when he was very young, in Anzio. And the importance of this is that it was in Anzio that he observed that people who were recently injured didn't seem to experience pain. And he went back to the Mass General Hospital, where he was the first chief of the Department of Anesthesia there, and he studied a matched cohort of young men who had surgery, and their pain experience was completely different. And he began to make us think about this idea of stress-induced analgesia. And then at about the same time, Melzack and Wall, this is where the gate control theory comes in, began to say, no, we're not thinking about line label systems anymore. We're talking about neuroplasticity. And it's really interesting because this photo on the right is Patrick Wall at MGH in the Ether Dome. I took the photo, so I got to know Pat Wall quite well in the last few years of his life. And what he would describe, which is interesting given what's going on today, is that when he first started mentioning that he thought that there was neuroplasticity, that pain was a plastic phenomenon, it was something that changed, he was shouted out of the room because the neurologists he was addressing were so convinced that it was a static thing that couldn't change. So it's really interesting as we go through thinking, our thought processes change or evolve, which is why I like the title, the evolution. It's really an evolution of the way we're thinking about it. This picture on the left, which is a warrior brandishing his leg in the air, which, is stress-induced analgesia illustrated, was also from Pat Wall, who just loved to show this illustration and what he meant. Now, the gate control theory was not entirely correct, but it was the sort of opening the floodgates to beginning to understand the importance of neuroplasticity. So the gate control theory was that if you stimulate large fibers or touch fibers, that can close the gate on the small fiber or the pain transmission. So now we're talking about something really different. We're talking about not just ascending, so you injure, as Descartes showed, and you get stimulation goes up to the brain. We're also talking about descending, the importance of descending pathways or top-down phenomena. So this slide is quite important because, I think what the person that dreamed up the title was driving at is how pathological events and opioids can lead to this central sensitization or a process in the brain that is actually making pain worse. So those processes in the brain are capable of making pain better, but they're also capable of making pain worse. So if you have an injury, a peripheral nerve injury, that leads to the signal that the physiologist discovered, an electrical signal, and when it gets to the brain, it results in a whole heap of changes, including microglial activation, neuroinflammatory process in the brain, and release of excess glutamine, cell death, actually apoptosis and reformation, so changes in the brain that may actually be permanent, and imprinting of the painful sensation. So, all of this goes towards explaining why some people have such profound changes in the brain after injury that those changes don't reverse even if the injury it improves. So this just very simply shows what happens when pain is amplified in the brain. And this shows some of how we fine-tuned it to the extent we even understand the molecular basis and the epigenetic changes that occur when you suffer injury and pain in the periphery, and the changes that happen in the nervous system. So these are glutamate channels, AMPA receptors, calcium channels. Nitric oxide is a very important mediator of hyperalgesia, as is neurokinin, substance P. The NMDA receptor is very important in the whole process of pain amplification that occurs because of the neural response to injury. So now I'm going to talk about how we are expanding our view of pain. So we're not so much focused as we were when I started training, or when we all went into medicine, on this reductionist view. We're thinking more about the importance of the dysphoric social dimension of pain. So the reductionist point of view focuses on subcellular and cellular events. It focuses on aberrant ion channel expression and neurotransmitters, ion channels, and receptor interactions. So this is a focus on what has been called microscale events. And what happens when you have that focus is that you drive a mechanism-based approach which drives mechanism-based treatment. And so for those type of treatments, which means essentially drugs and injections and surgery, the focus is on the nociception. So the focus is off all the other things that contribute to pain, particularly chronic pain. So the top-down viewpoint, which is on the right, is very different. It actually encompasses the microscale events, but it also transcends the microscale events. So this is more about the role of dysphoric social dimension, and it recognizes that that dimension contributes as much as nociception to the experience of chronic pain, and it also accepts that the mechanisms at the cellular level have evolved over millions of years as an adaptation to survival, or to the survival of the species, that these systems are essential for, in fact, they promote all behaviors that are essential to survival. So what this sort of way of thinking about pain drives is much more of a community-based approach, public health approach, and healthcare systems approach to the management of pain. So I have to attribute this to great thinkers in pain, John Lozier and Dan Carr. So on the right is John Lozier's very famous now pain onion, but what he's saying is that nociception itself is a very small part of pain behavior, and also a small part of the suffering that pain causes. What Dan Carr has said recently is that we shouldn't be thinking of pain as a biopsychosocial phenomenon. We should be thinking far more about it as a top-down phenomenon, or what he likes to say is socio-psychobiological phenomenon, not a biopsychosocial phenomenon. I love this quote, and I am showing it because when I read this is just from a novel. When I read this, my immediate thought, because I'm steeped in the world of pain and have been for a long time, was fibromyalgia. But what the author is trying to say is that emotional disruption or catastrophe, or in this case, sudden loss of love, results in physical pain. So what he said is, my love had gone away and left me standing here in a puddle of grief. My world yesterday had the lightness and glossy tension of a freshly inflated party balloon. Now today, with her gone, everything was suddenly slack and tacky to the touch. Anguish, this constant, unremitting anguish, made me tired, terribly tired. Yet I didn't know how I might rest. I felt dry all over, dry and hot, as if I'd been scorched, and my eyes ached, and even my fingernails pained me. So now we're beginning to see with actual things we can measure, which include functional MRI and some biochemical measurement, that these phenomena, which are sort of out of the box, outside medicine, are actually demonstrable in a scientific way. So this is work from Apkarian's group, which is really key, important work in terms of beginning to understand scientifically what all this is about. And what you see on this slide is how develops an overlap between pain, emotion, and reward as pain progresses, so over time. So in the dark black bars, that is chronic pain, and the light gray bars are short-term pain. And as pain chronicifies and becomes more chronic, the areas overlap. So the area that is initially purely anatomically and physiologically what you would expect from painful stimulation overlaps with emotional and reward centers. So this is the neuromatrix. There's nothing new about it. It's the way people have been thinking since the 60s about how all these different factors contribute to the neuromatrix that produces the experience of pain. But what's important is to see that of all these things that are contributing, the pathological input and the afferent input is actually only a very small part of what ends up being the experience of pain. This I can also attribute to Dan Carr, the idea that we could develop a systems map, and this has been done for obesity, but I'd really like to see it done for pain. What this shows is that what contributes to the central problem of obesity is not just physiology or even just what the person eats or how the person exercises. It's all the big factor from social and community activities, such as what food is actually being produced, what is the social milieu, what is the culture. These are factors that are contributing in a far greater way than the actual, what the individual is doing. So this is a very interesting idea in terms of thinking about what we know now and how we got to this terrible epidemic. These cultural factors are terribly important in all this. And this comes from the Institute of Medicine's report. Again, if you look on the right, if you look at what happens to people outside the healthcare system on the right, and people who engage with the healthcare system, so people who are managing their pain outside the system and within the system, you end up at the top with people who find alternatives themselves to treat pain and people who live with chronic pain. And you end up with exactly the same thing if you go through the healthcare system. You still have people who find alternatives to pain and people who live with chronic pain. And you also have people who develop complications and people whose pain gets progressively worse. So what about opioids? You probably noticed that I've gone through all this talk about pain and haven't even mentioned opioids. And there's a reason for that, and that is that if you look at the evolution of thinking about pain, we didn't even know that there was an endogenous opioid system until remarkably recently. So for a very long time, thousands of years in fact, we were thinking about pain completely differently from thinking about opioids. Opioids were there to treat pain, but we had no idea that there was an endogenous opioid system, or that a lot of what we were seeing was actually something to do with opioids. It seems extraordinary now because we're in a different place and our knowledge is completely different. But the reality is we didn't really know. In fact, I always say, when I was a medical student, which was in the 70s, I learned my physiology from Ganon, and the endogenous opioid system wasn't even in Ganon because we didn't know about it in the 70s. Now, it's really remarkable considering what we know now. So use of opiates has been a human activity since Sumerian times, so 5000 BC. Nothing new about using opioids. So opium is 50% morphine. That wasn't even discovered till the 19th century. And morphine was isolated. That was the beginning of a sort of pharmacological production of opioid drugs. I just wanted to show, so on the left is from when I was exploring the evolution in thought about pain. I want to try and compare it with the evolution of thinking about opioids. When Melzack and Wall thought about neuroplasticity and the fact that it wasn't a line-label system and began to suggest that something was going on that altered pain in different ways, people studying opiate addiction began to think there had to be a system of receptors because that was the only way you could explain what they were seeing pharmacologically. So by that time, they had lots of different opiates. They were giving prisoners, actually, the center was in a prison in Kentucky, and they were giving the different opiates, and they said there have to be opiates. In fact, they came up and named all the opiates all the receptors we know about today, just on the basis of this. But they still hadn't discovered the receptor. That was a little bit later in the 1970s. That's where it opened it up to understanding the role of this endogenous system. Once the receptors were discovered, very quickly led to the discovery of the endogenous ligands, the endogenous opioids. And again, that was on the basis that now we know the receptors exist, there must be endogenous ligands, otherwise the receptors wouldn't exist. So again, compare, what I was talking about pain, the coming to the top-down viewpoint, and what we now understand, the way we think about opioid systems and what the role of the opioid system is, or the endogenous opioid system. Two important categories. One is that they provide stress-related pain relief and, importantly, pain enhancement or injury-related physical pain. And secondly, and importantly, they facilitate maternal, infant, and other attachments. So those are really, important roles of the endogenous opioid system. So they're there for the fight and flight, and they're there for social attachments. So old-fashioned physiology, fight and flight, we think of, all the things that happen and all the stress hormones that are released for fight and flight. We never really thought about opioids, but when you look at it, opioids are involved in all of these things as well. And then we know and have known for a long time that the catecholamines, corticosteroids, insulin, ACH, these hormones that are involved in stress responses, the seat of these actions is the hypopituitary adrenal axis. Well, it's also the seat for endorphins. So we have to add endorphins to this list of traditional mediators that we know for stress responses. This is also important. It doesn't look like much, but it's important when you're thinking about what is the role of opioids in the endogenous system. So in chase, when the lion is in chase, it's not going to experience any pain at all, even though what's happening would be painful if it wasn't that it was this situation of being in chase. But what's more important is that when the lion is recovering, has been injured and is resting and recovering, what's existing is a dual state of hyperalgesia and analgesia. So as long as you don't go near the injured paw, it's not painful, it's analgesic. The moment you touch it, it's hypersensitive. So it's a coexistence of hyperalgesia and analgesia that the opiate systems are really important. Now, they're also this, what Clifford Walsh would call this inflammatory soup in the periphery, but that doesn't really explain the hyperalgesia completely, because if it existed on its own, then it would be painful. So it's the opiates that may allow it to exist in tandem, the hyperalgesia and the analgesia. So now, again, look on the right, this is where we got to in terms of understanding pain. But lo and behold, the things that produce opiate-induced hyperalgesia are exactly the same systems. It's the NMDA receptor, it's glutamate receptors, it's calcium channels, it's protein C. It's a very similar process. So what we're beginning to see is that actually the way that we began to think about pain, stress-induced analgesia, the top-down effects, are so closely linked to opioid systems that they really can't be separated. In fact, it's opioid systems that are so intimately involved in this whole process that the opioid system is our pain system. It is the way we defend ourselves. This is just a more detailed and much prettier illustration of what happens with opiate-induced analgesia that came out of Nature Reviews very recently, 2015. Again, all the same receptors, but now we're talking about opioid effects and not just pain effects, not just effects that result from the response to the injury, but also exactly the same mechanisms that are happening with the response to opiate use. So we mustn't forget also that underlying all this, and a very important component of this, is the mesocorticolimbic system, which is the seat of addiction or the reward centers, because it's because of opiate role in this reward center that you see the development of addiction, because this center is responsible for perpetuating behaviors that are good to the species, such as sexual activity, eating, and also pain, and pain, experiencing pain plus being able to suppress pain. Actually, the pain pathways are different in green, but the mesocorticolimbic system in red and subsequent higher center involvement is the seat of the behaviors of the behavioral component of what opiates do. So I'm just going to talk for a while about some brilliant work that was done by Howard Fields. He's professor of both addictionology and pain science in University of San Francisco. And what he talks about is state-dependent opioid control of pain. What he shows in the upward and downward pain pathways, this is actually referring to the downward, top-down transmission, is that there are two types of cell, or two types of pathways, one that's inhibitory and one that's facilitatory. And they're labeled in green and red, as separate pathways. So what he has shown is that that top-down pathway can be activated by both external painful stimuli and by motivational states. And that cells in the brain, the rostroventromedial medulla, can exert both inhibitory, the green, and facilitatory, the red, control. So what he's describing is a reciprocal and state-dependent neuronal activity. And this dual control results in the activity of two distinct neuronal subpopulations. And they exhibit reciprocal firing. So what the terminology he used is that these are off cells and on cells, which is very easy to get your head around. The idea that these same cells are capable of turning on, and a separate set of cells is responsible for turning things off. So the on cells result in a burst of activity and facilitate neuroreceptive transmission, and the off cells result in a pause in the firing. So the concept is that it can operate in two distinct modes. And what he argues is the action of opioids contributes to and is determined by the state of the circuit, and that opiate drugs can actually either worsen pain or relieve pain depending on the behavioral state. So this is how he shows, and this incidentally is work that's done in rats, and it's done with actual probes that show these neuronal pathways. This is how he envisages this works within the rostroventral medulla. So this is a profound and important statement that he made. Pain is primarily a motivational state that has a powerful influence on decision making. He says that because the biologically relevant output of the nervous system is behavior, that the circuits are meaningfully defined in relation to the specific behaviors. And that through classic conditioning, so through changes over time, the way you respond to pain or think about pain, initially neutral contextual cues can acquire motivational power and actually elicit opiate-mediated analgesia. So the really important thing is in this very simple figure. If you look at the top, the mu opioid agonists, like morphine, they turn off on cells, they turn on off cells, and they can be blocked by mu opioid antagonists. But look at the bottom. If you put a predator into the cage with the rat, which is exactly what he did, so showed the rat under stress, exactly the same thing happens. The on cells get turned off, the off cells get turned on, and it can be blocked by mu opioid antagonists. So this is remarkable science that's showing how the circumstance can alter the way an animal's own endogenous system responds, but can also alter the way it responds to the drug. So what does all this mean when it comes to treating chronic pain? Well, I wouldn't seek to say that all chronic pain is the same, or that we have a unified way of treating chronic pain, because chronic pain is chronic pain. Chronic pain isn't a single entity. Chronic pain is a whole load of different things. So the first is the one we're most sort of troubled by and maybe interested in, and that is where there's no obvious pathoanatomic diagnosis or process that's producing the pain. So this isn't something we can get our heads around very easily because it isn't something we can fix. Or it may be that there is something there, but the amount of pain that we're seeing isn't concordant with the pathology that we're seeing. But it also may be that it's easy to conceptualize the cause, and we may want to use primary treatments, or we may want to treat the symptom of pain. It may be that the pain existed acutely, but it perpetuated, and we don't really understand why. In some people it gets perpetuated, or you get this central sensitization that makes sure it never goes away. Why that happens in some people and not others. And there may be sort of a chronic disease like sickle cell, which we can expect to cause exacerbations and relapses and pancreatitis. We sort of understand that, but the way people manifest it and present it, and the way what we're faced with in dealing with it is something that maybe we can alter, because we're learning how important the role of the brain and how the brain processes the pain itself is something maybe we can treat and help. So when patients are seeking medical treatment for pain, what they're telling us is that they're suffering, and they're crying out because they want us to help them with that. It may be expressed as physical pain, but often the roots of the pain are much, much deeper than whatever's going on physically. The roots of the pain are created by past experiences, by present fears, terribles going on, and it may not be explained by the pathology or found at all in the body. We know from modern imaging that we can see most pathological causes of pain, but when we're presented with two patients, one with imaging that makes us think, gosh, that must be incredibly painful, and another where we look at it and say there's nothing wrong with this patient, but it's the one where we look at the image and says there's nothing wrong with this patient that's reporting far worse pain than the one who's got terrible changes that we, in our minds, think, oh, well, that explains why they've got pain. So we understand that two individuals with exactly the same pathology may experience the condition completely differently. For one person, the physical pain becomes the focus for a life of suffering, while for the other, the physical pain is sublimated or even disappears. So back to comparing where we are with our understanding of opiates with our understanding of the top-down phenomenon. the fact is that the opiate systems are intimately involved in group processes, community, social factors, what happens to people, and in the top-down effects. So isolation, withdrawal, distress, loss of job, family, people, the cultural milieu in which people find themselves, the expectations in terms of pain and how it will be treated. They're all indicators of, if they present to us, of derangements in the natural opioid system. So the natural opioid system isn't coping in the way it's capable of coping. And that's why we see these patients with, who come to us seeking help for the suffering. We now know that the pain and opioid systems evolved through evolutionary processes over millions of years, or we accept that. Even though we're only recently understanding that, we now accept that this is not something that developed overnight. It's a way we've adapted during evolution. The problem is that when we give exogenous opioids, we overwhelm these systems. And they're the natural systems that help us deal with pain, but once we commandeer that whole system, the system of receptors, we are sort of not allowing that system to work for us. So we also know that the central top-down control contributes as much as nociception to the experience of pain. So that top-down process, which is intimately involved with opiate systems, is a really powerful means of controlling pain. And that, I think, is where we get to today, is why we're beginning to think really differently about how we manage pain. So on the left is what I was taught, is what we would do when I was taught pain medicine or anesthesia or even medicine. Someone comes presenting with pain, we investigate, we do an intervention if possible. If not possible, we give mild analgesics, and if the mild analgesics don't help, we give strong analgesics. Now we do something really differently. Now we measure the whole person. We try to get at the root cause of pain. So we're measuring for depression, anxiety, psychiatric comorbidities, history of substance abuse, and particularly past traumas, particularly childhood traumas, sexual abuse, which is terribly common in these refractory chronic pain patients. We take a much broader, holistic approach. We counsel, we encourage self-help, self-management. We try to address the pain problem in that way, or this is what we try to teach people to do. And if necessary, we use mild analgesics. But we try not to progress to, I deliberately left opioids or strong analgesic off this, because we try not to progress to strong analgesics. So now I come back to this, the evolution of the way we thought about pain. We came from only a couple of 100 years ago, actually, or 500 years ago. In the scheme of millions of years, it's not that long. Thinking that pain was caused by external events, and importantly, dealing with pain by glorifying it, by saying, if I can withstand this pain, that's how I can cleanse my soul. And so there was a motivation for that sort of coping strategy. To where we all came in, the reductionist starting point, thinking about it in mechanistic terms, that by thinking about it that way, we can solve it with drugs, injections, operations, we can do mechanical things and treat the pain. We're now beginning to think much more broadly and include the importance of the dysphoric social dimension. So I'm really pleased that the National Pain Strategy, which has just been released, has emphasized all this. It's all over the National Pain Strategy. It's talking about self-management, about interdisciplinary pain management, which is absolutely necessary to help these. Not all, as I said, not all chronic pain is the same. Not all chronic pain needs to be treated in an aggressive, interdisciplinary, multimodal way, but the complex ones really do. They never make any progress unless we can provide this for the complex chronic pain. And so I'm really pleased to see that the National Pain Strategy recognizes that and wants to promote self-management of pain and avoidance of, recognizes the limitations of medicine, because this is what it's all about. There's a lot that we expect medicine to do that medicine can't do because social phenomena. And so I just want to finish by putting back into your minds this systems map, the idea that where we're going now is much more broad societal community. It's that we have to think outside the box and not just that we can solve this with medications. We can't. We need to solve it with much broader approach. So luckily I finished because my voice seems to be going. Thank you.